Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Emerald Planet. All the ecology news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's your host, Executive Director of the Emerald Planet, Dr. Sam Lee Hancock.
Hello and welcome to the Emerald Planet as we come to you from Washington, D.C. in the United States as we look around the globe in 144 different nations, looking for those 1,000 best practices, the technology, services, and products that are making a difference as we move through the 21st century. And as we face severe climate change and weather becomes more violent as it relates to the climate that's going on around us, how do we look at this nexus between climate change, weather, and climate? And I have a gentleman that's sitting right beside me that's going to talk about these things and how that natural disasters, which we many times blame on nature, actually are mostly man-made, and that's what we're finding out. And this gentleman is doing extensive amount of research and has been for over 30 years. This is Dr. Vinod Thomas. He's a visiting professor from the National University of Singapore. Also, he's a visiting professor at the Asian Institute of Management in Manila, Philippines, and a former senior vice president of the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Dr. Thomas, you're a well-traveled man.
Thank you.
Glad to have you with us. And this is a topic that I've been wanting to have for quite a long time. I keep reading reports, but I wanted somebody to actually come on the Emerald Planet that actually could address this from the standpoint of all the research. And I wanted to say in advance, you've documented this very well, so we have all the source documents. And so if anyone has any questions about this or would like to have this in the future, we'll certainly be glad to share it with them. But looking at the mission and vision of the National University of Singapore, you really talk about the nexus between climate change, natural man-made disasters. You're actually at the nexus of the most exciting region of the whole Earth, which is Asia.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about this university and why is it so important?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Sam. Indeed, Asia is about the most dynamic region in the world with incredible increase in population as well as well-being of the people over the past 5 decades. Singapore and the National University of Singapore is the oldest university in the country. It has about 40,000 students, and it's known for excellence, but also partnerships, including with the United States. In 1905 as part of the then Malaya, and then Singapore in 1962 as it became a country. It started as a medical college, but then now is in all different areas of our concern, from urbanization to climate change.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about what we're seeing right here. This almost, you could say it's almost a contagion rolling around the globe. No matter where you are these days, whether you're in a northern or southern hemisphere, what country, what continent, we're experiencing very similar things. So what is it that we're really seeing as far as the size, the scale, the magnitude now of what we're calling natural, but most of it's really man-made disasters?
Right. These disasters, by one estimate, have tripled over the last 40 years. We are seeing more intense ones, and we are seeing more frequent ones, particularly floods and storms, and heat waves and droughts. All of those can be characterized as climate-related ones. And the damages that they are causing are extraordinary. I mean, in 2017 in the United States, some 300 billion were the losses, and that's the size of Singapore in national income terms.
Yeah, and the whole thing about this is that as we see these disasters right in front of us, the United States is growing in population, so we're 320 plus million and growing. So we're moving into less desirable areas, and also people are looking for more comfort. They want to get away from the urban areas, although they want to be very urban, because 80% of America is now urban. So what is this, talk about this nexus, but this juxtaposition, if you will, of humanity moving into these more and more remote areas, and then putting burden on the natural resources,
right.
Water, air, forest, all these things within these areas.
Precisely. I think we have gotten used to natural disasters as natural phenomenon, and there is a big part of it which is just natural. We are used to them. However, 3 things have gotten out of hand. One I would call the exposure of people such that they are locating more and more in harm's way. Houston, Texas would be a case. People say that people are located where they shouldn't be in the face of a tremendous disaster. Secondly, it is the vulnerability of the people. The ability to cope with big disasters is also not keeping up. For example, Puerto Rico was hit by a storm which the country was not able to deal with. Mm-hmm. And the third I would add is a new person or new phenomenon that has entered the situation, which is climate change. The disasters are more frequent and they are more intense. And if you're prepared to take an intermediate exam and you're given a final exam which is of a high level, you just are not able to cope.
Yeah. And looking at this photograph from Japan, Japan is a temperate country, very moderate, winters, summers, spring, fall. And yet now they're having higher temperatures than any records that they have, and they're going back thousands of years in Japan because they're going back to their raw records to try to find these heat waves and the intensity as far as the heat waves. So what are we seeing, and this is something you referred to, but let's talk about the intensity as far as what we're seeing, because people are saying, well, we've always had forest fires, we've had floods, but people are saying, and I think you brought this out too, that the margin is maybe 30% higher and more intense than what we've had in the past.
Right. The increase in temperatures around the world, that is a global phenomenon everywhere. However, those places that are closer to the sea level and particularly hit by those like California, Japan, they're seeing the temperatures go beyond what human capabilities are to withstand. And so the effects are extraordinary. California, as a case in point, has faced the worst forest fires over the last 2 years, 2017 and 2018. Japan has not seen this kind of heat wave in the past. Now, is it all because of climate change? No, because there have been heat waves, but scientists are increasingly pinning the fact that because of the greater emissions of carbon in the air, there is a direct link between that and the temperatures, which then clearly cause the heat waves, but also cause more rainfall through the higher precipitation.
Yeah, and this is something we're finding. The West Coast is drying out. The East Coast, at the same time, is having higher precipitation than it's ever had, or at least, in maybe the last 100, 150 years. So looking at this is the Philippines. They're going through the same thing. But again, this is rolling around the globe. So we're seeing this in virtually all countries. And then when you look at a place like Australia, which is, a huge continent of its own, but yet because of the dust and the drought, is they're even closing Sydney Airport.
Right.
Beijing has experienced that as the dust comes off of the Gobi Desert. So how are countries and people going to cope with the intensity that we're now seeing?
Right. I think the first part of this is the real diversity of what's happening. The very same country, like China, in the case of even California, a state within the United States, you are seeing both intense floods and intense droughts and heat waves. And that's because on the one side, the heat is just a direct contributor to the heat wave, but then it's also warming the water, putting more vapor into the air, holding that for a longer period of time and causing more intense rains. So the diversity within the same country and surely across countries is extraordinary. With the threshold having gone up so much, the ability to withstand is really getting difficult. Countries are doing what they can, and you give very high marks and kudos for recovery and recuperation and rehabilitation, for example, after the Houston floods. However, the test is so much higher that all the recovery will not help if we don't go to the root cause. It's like the roof is leaking and we can put a bucket and very well and collect as much as we can. But if you don't fix the roof, this is going to keep going. And that's why I go back to the origin of this increase that we are seeing to climate change.
Yeah. And looking at Bangladesh, this is something I was there just a few years ago and standing in the capital city, and people were saying, look across the street. I looked across the street, looked like the same city. they're saying that's where the Bay of Bengal can be. That's almost, 40% of the country could be underwater by 2050. By 2050. That's roughly 50 million people that the nation itself is saying could be displaced.
Right.
And where are we going to put all these people? Because we already have too many people throughout the entire country of Bangladesh. And then, of course, in Kolkata, there's almost 6 million, at least, of people from Bangladesh that are camping out along the rail tracks. So where are these people going to go if displacement, and they're saying now 60 million people, maybe half of those are environmental refugees, where are they going to go?
This is not far-fetched. The example of Bangladesh clearly is both a striking and extreme example, but also commonplace if you look at the world as a whole. Pacific Islands, low-lying regions of South India right now, the heaviest floods we have seen is taking place in Kerala and Karnataka. Now, a projection from the World Bank is that by 2050, conservatively, 140 million people will be migrants, refugees related to climate change.
So they're calling them climate refugees.
Climate refugees, climate-related migration. And it started, the leaders of Pacific Islands have very vocally expressed their concern that we have been used to a lot of things, but how do you face the fact that my country will go underwater? That's how the Prime Minister's put it.
And this is already happening.
This is already happening. This is not far-fetched. And that's the most incredible thing about climate change, that we used to think of it as a future problem, but it is a problem happening today and in our backyard.
Now, going back to this, as far as infrastructure, they talk about hardening the infrastructure assets. What do we need to do? And we're going to go out on this question. What do we need to do over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years to take care of the infrastructure so that people actually do have a margin of security and safety in all this, and we have to be quick?
I think we touched on the need for mitigation, that is to prevent the situation getting out of hand further, but adaptation, regardless of the mitigation, has to take place too. That means reinforcing infrastructure. Disaster proofing, to the extent we can, should be part of every project and every program. Also, not letting people locate in harm's way through zoning and regulation would be the second.
As this poor gentleman is talking about and sitting there, with his house completely destroyed. This is Dr. Vinod Thomas, National University of Singapore. Thank you for being with us and sharing this sobering thought and the images that you brought with us as we look around the globe. Great emerald planet. Good job.
I surrender.
All right, pal. Get ready for the day, buddy.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Dad. Do we have a gun?
What's up?
Do we have a gun?
Maybe you can make retirement happen. After all, you made this vacation happen.
Double points with every purchase?
Cleverly merging promotions.
Love it.
Cross-referencing travel sites. And booking all your flights with those...
Vouchers. I got us bumped.
They were like, oh. But now they're like... Aloha. You aced this vacation. Now get the tips you need to get on track at aceyourretirement.org.
I tried Oxy at a couple of parties. I thought I had it under control. I didn't know it'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
What to expect when you're expecting.
Like here?
A teenager.
Today, I'm going to show you how to team-proof your home. First step, hide the car keys. Preferably somewhere they would never look. Challenges will come up. Be ready for them. Hi, honey.
Ready for the... Mom, you don't use mannequins in the mannequin challenge.
You don't have to know it all to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same.
We're back to the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello and welcome to the Emerald Planet as we're looking around the globe for what we call those 1,000 best practices, the technologies, services, products, and processes that are making a difference as we move towards 2050. By 2050, they're estimating we may have another 2 billion, yes, 2 billion people on planet Earth. And how we're going to be able to take care of all these people as far as the food, the fuel, the fiber, and all the basic infrastructure that they need in light of severe and ever more violent climate change. And so we're going to look at the facts and figures. All of this is very well documented. We're happy to share this information with anyone that will make contact with us about all of this, because this is coming from Dr. Vinod Thomas. He's a visiting professor at the National University of Singapore, also a visiting professor at the Asian Institute of Management in Manila in the Philippines, and a former senior vice president at the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. So you've had a very rich background. And I know through your whole history, you've actually been looking at this whole thing as far as climate change and man-made and natural disasters. So looking at that, many people are asking, what is it about being in Singapore at the National University of Singapore that allows you to really accelerate your studies as far as what's happening to the climate and these disasters?
Well, thank you, Sam. Singapore is a premier university, rated #1 in Asia, or in concerns that we are talking about. Asia is in a unique position as one region that is most hit by natural disasters and the effects of climate change. At the same time, it's also a major contributor to carbon emissions. So it is both a part of the solution and part of the problem. So Singapore's work on this is very, very appropriate, and that brings me to some of the research that we have done.
Yeah, and the fact is that you're at Singapore and you have India, which some people are saying now is already maybe has more people than China, about 1.3 plus, 1.4 billion people. China with about 1.2, 1.3 billion. And then you have all these other countries locked in there. So a huge number of the world's population in this one major region, you know, spread across, in essence, 2 continents. So you really are at, you know, the pinpoint as far as looking at all this. But many people are saying, what's the difference between weather and climate?
Well, I think simply put, weather is more local and climate is more regional and global. But at the same time, weather also refers to more immediate changes day to day, maybe week to week. But climate is a bit more time sensitive in terms of the length of time you allow before you record it as a climatic change. We need to look at both, and both are bringing us full of surprises.
Yeah. Now, looking at this chart, as far as what's going on here, the carbon emissions and looking at the increase in temperatures, you're saying these are actually trending in the same direction. So tell us about that, because you have a few deniers that say none of this is really impacting, but the majority of scientists and the scientific research is saying this is the trend.
Right. Now, the deniers' view, to grant a certain part of it, I would say that, yeah, it is possible and it is true that 4 million years ago, things like this may have happened. That doesn't deny the fact that they are happening today, which is that the increase in carbon emissions, especially in the last 100 years, and the increase in temperature during the same period fit like a glove. Econometricians won't be able to sleep when they see this kind of a one-to-one relationship, and that's undeniable.
Yeah, and looking at these, the records, they're going back, and people say, well, it's something, it's just a recent phenomena, but if you're tracking it, you know, because many countries that didn't even exist in the 18th and 19th century, now at least they have 100, 150 years of history they can look back on. And then, of course, if you go to the Arctic and the Antarctic, you can go through the ice cores and now you're having tens of thousands of years, even millions of years in that are showing what's going on. So what are we seeing?
So clearly, we could have argued that a particular virus was present millions of years ago for a variety of reasons, and then argue that today we see an outbreak of some of this violence in urban centers because of an incredible expansion of garbage and lack of collection. Right. The latter still calls us, despite the history, calls us to action in collecting garbage. So the same way the carbon link to temperatures calls us to take a look at the carbon emissions and see it as a cause that is making temperatures unbearable. 1 degree higher today than prior to the pre-industrial revolution, and scientists say that if it goes up another degree, all bets are off, and that we could be living in an ice-free planet. At the rate which carbon emissions are continuing to rise, which is from 400 parts per million to 411 now in a few years, tells us that in 20 years we could reach 450, which is a threshold for really catastrophic situations.
But if you look at this map of the globe and you see these hot spots, I mean, there's very few places there's not hot spots. I mean, the majority of the world, and definitely the bulk of the populations are in these hot spots. So what does this tell people that we're looking at right here as far as the temperatures are concerned,
right,
and the continued increase year to year? Because every year they're saying, well, this is the hottest on record, whether it's China or Russia or the United States or Uganda, and then the next year, this is hot.
Right.
Keep ratcheting.
Right. Well, people living in temperate zones, including in the United States, in many places, have thought of this as a phenomenon affecting tropical countries, faraway places, and so on. Look at 2017. Some of the worst heat waves were experienced in Sweden, Greece, California, and the west coast of the United States.
Finland.
And Finland.
Yes.
So we are looking at a situation where the increase in heat is global, and so the difficulty of coping with it is both for rich countries and for poor countries. I think one point to note is that within the United States, you also see that that increase varies across states, so it's not completely uniform. So California is one of those that has faced the greatest increase from their normal levels, and so the reaction or the response needs to be appropriately differentiated.
Yeah, but you look at this map of the United States and you see the distribution as far as the heat across the entire continental United States, all 48 states. You see only 2 areas here which are moderate.
That's right.
And the rest of them are increasing, and some of these are even in the danger zone.
Right.
So what do we need to be thinking about as far as telling people what they're going to be looking for as to the future of all this?
Right. These, of course, are increases from what they're used to, and so when you're already in a warm state, and then you have that extreme red picture, that means that that is an unbearable situation. Why? In terms of, let's say, forest fires, those could last as much as 3 extra weeks by 2050 if the current trend continues. And
yeah,
actually,
3 extra weeks.
3 extra weeks, and that is the difference between life and death. Already it is, but 3 extra weeks will be very hard for our capabilities to withstand. And so that's a distinction that we need to make, that where it's warm and when the effect is augmented by the highest amount across the states, then all bets are off.
Yeah, looking at this map here, California burning is the title of this. The whole thing is that you're consuming natural resources that are precious for people to be using as the population continues to expand. We're putting overloads as far as the mountains and the plains, anywhere that they're supposed to be holding water. And so that water is rushing off, going into the tributaries and out into the ocean in many cases. And at the same time, people are feeling intensity and the intensity on their pocketbooks, because taxes are going to have to go up to pay for all of this. So what we need to be thinking about climate change and our pocketbooks at the same time as climate change and our personal comfort and health and safety.
Indeed, there is a pocketbook issue, and let me just say that it is a wicked problem in the sense that with the temperatures rising, you need also more energy to run the cooling systems, which, if we do not switch to low carbon sources, make the heat problem worse. And secondly, those states, or in some instances countries, that are least responsible for the increase in carbon emissions because of the
like
energy
developing
use,
states,
like
or
developing
emerging states.
or within the United States, a progressive state that is making the switch to low carbon like California, happen to be the ones hit the most. So it's an asymmetry. So for both counts, we have a wicked problem. And in the end, the pocketbook issue, the governor of California said, we have a beautiful state, but we need massive resources to deal with this problem, which in many ways is beyond the state's control.
Yeah, looking at this whole thing as far as the increase of what they're now even called cloud bombs. Cloud bombs. I've never heard that before. And in Washington, D.C., we've been experiencing those the last 2 years. And when these goes off, they just drench everything, and more flooding is occurring. People are living in homes that are built in some of them in the late 1700s, the 1800s, early 1900s. Never had a flood. All of a sudden now their basements are just flooding on a consistent basis. So what's this connection between the heat, the climate change, and the water?
Right. I think the heat, its relation to the droughts and heat waves perhaps is more direct, but its relationship to rainfall and flooding is equally compelling. The seawater temperatures warming as a result of more heat trapping greenhouse gases in the air means that there is greater evaporation of that into the air. Plus, when the air is warmer, it's also able to hold that evaporation longer. And then when it comes down,
so this is the bomb.
This is the bomb. When it comes down, you are hit by an unprecedented rainfall. And then it turns into floods for, again, some natural reasons, but also man-made reasons, such as how the drainage systems and its effect on people is related to how well the structures are built up. So if they were not prepared for this sort of thing in the past, then the structures again need to be reinforced. So it's a whole list of things that we need to do and can do.
So what we're going to be seeing is these two images here of, more water, flooding, and then more drought and devastation as far as the Earth is concerned. This is Dr. Vinod Thomas, National University of Singapore. Thank you for sharing these dire warnings. Now we need to look for some solutions. And thank you for being with us as we look around the globe to create the Emerald Planet.
So, I just moved in with this family, and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that. That's disgusting. Oh, poop already. You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
So how was work?
It was 1,300 hours. My math class from 302 was in the trenches. Davy Roth had it the worst. Fractions were coming at him left and right. He just didn't get the damn things. 2 days ago, I tried to teach him what 1/4 of 1/2 was using different sizes of blocks. Yesterday, I tried again by dividing up pizza. Both missions failed.
Oh, no.
But today, I was ready. I created a combat math game where the only way to beat the enemy is to out-fraction them. Davy conquered every last denominator. My game was so successful, the principal is deploying it to math squadrons all over the school.
Anywho, how was your day?
Oh, today my boss treated the office to salad wraps.
Salad wraps.
No.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
We're back to the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello and welcome to the Emerald Planet as we're looking around the globe to talk about climate change, about that intersection between climate change and man-made and natural disasters, and the perils that's bringing on the planet as these disasters seem to be just rolling around the globe and going almost 12 months out of the year, regardless of what temperate climate we're in, whether we're in the northern or southern hemisphere. There seems to be a similarity as far as the impacts of the climate and also what we're seeing as far as the local weather patterns. And I have a gentleman who is with the National University of Singapore, also the Asian Institute of Management in Manila, Philippines, formerly of the World Bank here in Washington, D.C. This is Dr. Vinod Thomas, and he's been working on this for well over 3 decades now, as far as what's going on with the weather, with the climate, and also natural disasters. So what are we seeing? We talk about this nexus or the intersect between these. Where you are and the research that you've been doing and the work you've been doing over these last 3+ decades, how is that now playing out what you saw early on, but now it's becoming more intense?
Thank you, Sam. When I worked at the World Bank and then at the Asian Development Bank, we did some evaluations of hundreds of projects that the two institutions have done in natural disaster management. And we were struck by a graph which showed that over the last 30 to 40 years, you have seen a fair steady pattern of what are called geophysical disasters like earthquakes and volcanoes. But somehow the hydrometeorological ones, floods, storms, and heat waves and droughts, they have taken off the chart. And we had to ask ourselves, why are these two sets of phenomena so distinct? And that took us to the link between the hydrometeorological ones with climate phenomenon, and digging deeper into that became a necessity.
Mm-hmm. Now looking at this is a very complex chart, although it seems very clear. So explain this to our viewers both here and abroad. What are we looking at and how does that actually relate to this intersect between the climate change, human-made and natural disasters, and the intensity of these? And I think that's what's so striking as far as the research. It's the intensity and the magnitudes of these disasters.
At the center of this picture, we have the disaster risk and the management of that risk. And clearly, disasters are the result of multiple factors. You could say that we have hazards of nature, but they become disasters because of 3 things that have been changing. One is just the exposure of people. Purely with population density rising, people are locating more and more in harm's way, and particularly the lower income people would be the ones first to be locating in the harm's direction. And that makes things more difficult, and this has been getting worse. Even Houston, Texas, you could say that people were locating where they should not be because of the pressures of urbanization, and so that was a factor.
And more wrapped around the coast too, because more and more people are moving out of the hinterlands into the coastal areas, because that's most of the major cities, the seaports, transportation hubs, and all that.
Absolutely. Hurricane Irma, you could say that Florida would be a case in point. The second one, equally important, is the vulnerability. The same disaster hits 2 groups of people very differently. Look at the case of, again, Harvey in Houston and Maria in Puerto Rico.
Or what about Sandy in New York, New Jersey? Thought they were immune from all these kinds of major disasters, and it's right there.
Absolutely. An incredible example would be in 2008, Myanmar, the former Burma, lost 140,000 people to a flood and storm. 2 or 3 years later, Victoria in Australia faced the same intensity disaster of a storm, and there was no fatality. So the vulnerability of the people or the ability to cope was clearly different. So that's a second factor. The third, which is a newcomer in this discussion, is the role of the hazard itself being off the chart, that we have not seen them. And that is the climate-related relationship that we are noticing, especially for flood storms and droughts and heat waves.
Yeah, I tell you, this is just incredible. Now, looking at this, I mean, this is a disaster we're looking at here, but yet you're saying this may be a path forward. So we're going to go through these and just kind of talk about some of these things so people can have an idea of what we're seeing. It is a disaster, but at the same time, this may be a way forward to mitigate and or to adjust before we even have the impact of a disaster. So what are we looking at here?
That's right. I think these traditional methods that we have learned the hard way to perfect and improve still hold. That is, locating people away from danger zones. So if you are looking at regulations or zoning how far you should be living, rolling them back, as some countries, including the US, are doing now, would be a mistake. Secondly, reinforcing the housing and building them to standards and really implementing those steps would be a critical path.
Well, you look at this house and you say this really is a disaster, but at the same time the structure is still there. In other words, the core of this. And so yes, you have to replace the insides, the windows, maybe part of the roof, but yet the structure's still there. So is that a lesson in itself?
Absolutely. I think a simple lesson is not to rebuild the same way, but rebuild differently, better and different. It's a tough lesson to take because people worry that, well, it may be more expensive. Well, there is a 5% cost difference that we noticed in many of the field studies in reinforcing and doing things different. But that 5% pays off very handsomely down the road.
Well, we're not spending the 100% for total replacement is what you're saying. Looking at these early warning systems, tsunami hit in Indonesia, in Sri Lanka, southern India, you know, throughout that area, the Pacific. I mean, this is something that's critically important, and I think most of the world has taken that to heart.
Absolutely. I think the early warning system may be just about the most highest payoff among all the steps we can talk about. Just a couple of examples. One from India, a state of Odisha. They faced an incredibly tough storm in 2013, and the death toll from that storm was 99.5% less than from a similar one that hit a few years earlier, because in that process they learned the lesson that getting the message out, often through very simple means of radio broadcast or simply house-to-house warnings, made a huge difference, and the list goes on, including
Bangladesh. And also too, we're looking at these drills. This is something that many countries, you know, particularly through Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, are taking very close to heart because it's so repetitive now. Yeah. It's not like we're drilling for something that may happen in 5, 10, or 50 years. Right. It's something that it's probably going to happen again in the next few months or the next few years.
Absolutely. I think what we used to call once in 100-year event happens now once every 2 years often. One example would be in the south of the Philippines, which is not used to storms in the winter. In December of 2011, they were hit with once a 100-year storm, and they were totally unprepared. But they thought, well, this would happen again, but didn't realize it would happen in a year's time. Well,
so they had another 100-year storm in 2 years.
In 2 years. Luckily, they were better prepared even with that in the second year, and the death toll again was very, very much cut back.
Now, looking at these tsunami towers, this is in Indonesia, but this is something that actually this technique is being shared across Southeast Asia because, you know, it's just a matter of time till they have another one. And if you go back in the records of the Japanese and the royal records, again, almost 1,000 years ago, they had a similar kind of thing. So these are very simple lessons. What does this add to the cost of the building versus we lose the whole building?
Right.
Or we lose thousands of lives.
Right. I mean, in this case, there are two approaches. Both are complementary. One is to reinforce what you have, as I said, maybe perhaps with a very reasonable small additional cost of, say, 5% to the project, you gain a massive return. The other is to really have or introduce additional buildings that are built completely differently, in the sense that the first floor, you let that be for the water to flow through, and have shelters or shelters during the whole year on the second, third, and fourth floors. And example of Indonesia shows a dozen of those latter types were built at very high payoffs. And that's an example for many others to follow, because, as you say, these will happen again and again with greater frequency and greater intensity.
I was going to say the intensity. Intensity is really what it's all about. Looking at, and we've got the different types of light bulbs in here. How is that impacted? People say we go from this huge building, survival towers, down to light bulbs.
Right. So we have big macro stories, medium-sized stories. I guess the tsunami in Indonesia would fall into the second category. And then the small examples which add up. So you can go from the simple fluorescent lamps to the so-called compact lamps. Go from the incandescent to the CPF, the fluorescent lamp, to the LED electrodes. And in each case, what it does in terms of saving the amount of energy you need to emit a certain amount of light is just vastly different. And when households adopt that, it is incredible in terms of the impact it can have.
And far less heat.
And far less
heat.
Because
we're certainly getting enough heat.
We're getting the same light for far less heat.
Yeah. Looking at alternative energy sources, the costs are coming down dramatically. Absolutely. It's almost like the floor has dropped out as far as for solar and wind. And now they're saying that even solar is now competitive with natural gas.
That's correct. I think this is a bigger piece than the light examples we had, where the source of the energy of all kinds could shift from high carbon to low carbon. And historically, clearly, that problem has been the cost difference. So if you go from coal and oil and gas to the renewables, wind and solar, the difference used to be striking. That has come down, and on paper, in some instances, they have really come down to the point that the latter, the renewables, really are competitive. However, there are things to be worked out, storage and distribution.
Yeah, and the whole thing about this going to the sequestration of carbon, I mean, this really is the new story as far as we need to figure out ways to store it and to be able to use it for the future. Thank you. This is Vinod Thomas, National University of Singapore, as we're looking around the globe, looking at climate change and natural disasters. Thank
you. So he built secret hiding places where nothing could get in. The boy didn't like looking people in the eye. It made him feel uncomfortable. One day, he found out he had something called autism. His family got him help, and slowly, he learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org.
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies.
Selfie, nailed it. We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Craig, come on man, let's split a ride home.
Being a dad is an adventure full of special moments.
A cruise?
Ooh. Right. Unexpected moments.
I got this.
And even awkward moments.
Okay, Dad, thank you.
But every moment you spend with your kids, even the smallest moments, can make the biggest impact on your child's life. So take a moment to be a dad today.
So, I'm kind of new here, but I've noticed a trend. My human does this funny thing where she goes around and gets all my toys, and then she hides them in that basket by the door.
but it's always the same basket, and it's always in the same place. And then she acts so surprised when I find them, but, she's putting them in the same basket again. It's like, hello, that's where you put it last time. You were the worst at hide and go seek.
We're back to the Emerald Planet. Here again, your host, Dr. Sam.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, as we come to you from Washington, D.C. in the United States, looking at 144 different nations on a week-to-week basis. As we say, we're looking for the best of the best as far as solutions are concerned and the best practices that can carry us forward as we go to a planet of maybe 9 billion people by 2050 and perhaps 12 to 13 billion by the end of the century. And how are we going to be able to accommodate all these people so there's actually an increase in the quality of life and people are not just existing? But in order to do all that, we need to look at severe climate change and this nexus between climate change and man-made and natural disasters. Poor nature gets blamed for almost everything that humans are doing these days. And so we're looking at that, and the gentleman is sitting right beside me. This is Dr. Vinod Thomas. He's a visiting professor of the National University of Singapore, visiting professor at the Asian Institute of Management in Manila, Philippines, and over 30 years with the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. And has been thinking about this for all these many years because of the extreme cost that's going in to dealing with climate change and very simple ways, in many cases, of dealing with that. So, Dr. Thomas, welcome to the Emerald Planet.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. Looking at the 3 years and the 3 decades that you've actually been involved as far as this whole topic of climate change, investments in infrastructure, protection of humankind, through various means, it seems like possibly the United States is going in the opposite direction the world is going now as far as dealing with climate change and really preparing for the future. What are you seeing in these trends of, where we are and where we need to be going?
Well, United States has been a leader in providing the technologies to switch to more renewable forms of energy and go more low carbon. However, the policies have been back and forth. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there have been steps taken to improve the policy environment that encourages renewables and discourages fossil fuels and oil and gas in energy use. That could make a big difference. However, the reversal of the very same policies that have taken place in the last couple of years would be the major cause of concern, including the US not participating in the climate change discussions and accord from Paris in 2015. And the reasons, in a nutshell, could be many, but one is the concern that this would conflict with growth, which would be a mistake to think of, in the sense that controlling or dealing with climate change is not an impediment to growth, but really it is the only way the US and other countries can grow in the future.
Yeah, and we have to move forward. And looking at this chart we have here, as far as the intersect protection, recovery, all of that, what is this that we need to be looking at as far as doing both of these, and then it goes to recovery, response, preparedness? How does all that fit together as, we could say, a neat package?
Right.
But it balances the environment and economy.
In terms of this graph, which is very relevant for today, one part of it is, regardless of all the discussions of climate change, disasters are hitting us, and so we need to be much better in terms of emergency or crisis management. And there are many pieces to that. Even in an emergency room in a hospital, there are a lot of protocols you have to follow. The same way we need to deal with emergencies and crises that hit us very carefully and very well and in an organized way. That needs to be upgraded. At the same time, as we are talking about climate change, that's not enough. We need to be able to plan risk management as well over a longer period of time. Renewables we talked about, but there are many steps that would allow us to switch from a high carbon economy to a more low carbon economy.
Yeah, and you listen to many insurance companies, many are projecting to the future as far as risk are concerned. And so now climate change, the impacts of man-made natural disasters are now all becoming part of that, risk factor. And so it's increasing the rates. So if we factor in all of these things, when do we start moving towards the point where we can actually start bringing down the increased cost for the risk, so that then we have an investment in infrastructure, in new buildings and new designs like, LEED, passive house, and some of these.
Right. I mean, this is a vicious cycle which could be turned into a virtuous cycle, in the sense that in the first instance, the higher costs that we face because of the climate-related disaster factor into premiums and factor into everything else. But at the same time, the more we act on that, the eventuality down the road will be lessened. And so the costs in real terms should come down. The payoffs to taking action on climate, the benefit cost ratio are anywhere from 5 to 25. They're very, very high. And the question is, well, why don't we act then? If it is so obvious, we take insurance for our houses in the eventuality of a flood. Flood is harder perhaps, but other disasters that we are hit with. I think it's a collective problem, and there are many reasons why people find it more difficult to act in unison, partly sometimes because you think someone else will deal with it.
Yeah. Now, looking at this carbon scenarios, what are we looking at here, and why is this so important to people understand?
Well, carbon has the direct impact on warming and has the direct impact on temperatures as well as rainfall, but its sources are multiple, and some of the sources are very closely related to our growth. For instance, coal and low-cost coal directly goes into production, and people would identify this as a source of short-term immediate growth. We need to switch from thinking about that only for the immediate growth, but also for the long-term growth. And that transition is a tough one, but that's a transition that will give us the biggest payoffs.
And we're looking at here from 2000 all the way to 2100. So what we're saying is this payoff is going to be longer term, but yet it's very real as far as climate change is concerned, and reducing the huge cost as far as man-made and natural disasters.
That's absolutely right. But the meaning of long-term is shrinking very, very rapidly. Just
because of the intensity
of what we are looking at. Just very simply put, we used to think that 400 parts per million of carbon is already high, and that anything that approaches 450 would be prohibitive. We have now reached 411, and that difference between that to 450 could be in a matter of 20 years at the current rate. So the long-term picture we had has really shrunk to something more immediate.
And decades lost. This is something that people can see this. 30 years ago we had a chance to change, and the greenhouse effect is large enough. That goes way back to 1988.
That's right.
And in many cases we're still not listening to what we had in the past.
That's right.
But knowledge into action, what do we need to be doing, Dr. Thomas?
Well, this is a so-called disconnect between what we know scientifically and what we need to do as a result. In many instances, we have acted when knowledge was available, and the social consciousness and movements have taken on issues all the way from abolishing slavery to universal rights for women to vote, and so on and so forth. So tough issues have been taken up because of social consciousness. This could happen in the case of climate, but it's becoming a longer and tougher journey. But the good news, if I may say, in an ironic way, is that the Ohio River got fire, and the Japanese found Minamata mercury poisoning, or there was a LA fog and the London fog. These are the sorts of, unfortunately, crisis events that prompted action and started the environmental movement and a lot of positive things followed. I hope we don't have a hard landing like that, that before that happens, we take action to avert the worst of climate change.
Well, looking at these sustainability goals, you know, economy, society, environment, the intersect between those. Actually, this is what Emerald Planet's been all about for a number of decades now. This is what the United Nations all about, what we're moving forward. How do we incorporate this in so we really do keep this balance between the economy, the environment, and society?
I would say two things. One, we are, for better or for worse, wedded to economic growth. And that economic growth needs to be thought of in terms of its quality and not just its quantity. And that shift will help. In doing that, usually there are two forms of capital that go into production, such as physical capital, but also human capital. And in a good way, the human capital has gotten recognition, which is great. But the third form of capital, which is the natural capital or the environmental capital, is yet to make its way into this equation. If we could change that calculus, and if we can elect people into offices who see the three forms of capital as essential, not for some esoteric goal, but for people's well-being today and tomorrow, we will be home.
We have this beautiful image here about this switch to low carbon and green earth, child holding it in his or her hand. Why do we need to take this to heart, this image?
This image brings together the three forms of capital. On the one side, that the green environmental capital is good for each of us, but also the generation, that it is today's problem, but it is a bigger and bigger problem down the road. So if we worry about our children and their children, this is an essential shift we need to make.
Yeah. And this, I just love this one. What if it's a big hoax and we created a better world for nothing?
Something to remember.
This is something we really have to remember. I just love this image. Okay, we're going to go out in this. Changing mindsets. I know this is part of your brainchild. So let's finish up with our session on this as far as we must change our mindsets, and we have to be quick. We have about 30 seconds.
I would say among all the things, we need to connect the dots, the relationship between human capital, physical capital, and natural capital, and the link between climate change and natural disasters. This needs to be internalized in our businesses in the interest of people's well-being today and tomorrow.
That's absolutely fantastic. Changing minds, not climates. Anyway, thank you for
much.
being with
Enjoyed
us.
it.
This is Dr. Vinod Thomas, a visiting professor, National University of Singapore, at the Asian Institute of Management in Manila, Philippines, and a former senior vice president of the World Bank. Thank you for being with us and sharing all this. Thank you to our viewers. Hopefully we've given you a lot of information for to think about as we create the Emerald Planet.